I used to do that all the time when I was director, but I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, I never got the notice. Okay. Are you serious?
Yes.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to our Wednesday research series.
It was informal around here.
Yeah, nice to have everyone. I suspect you all know each other, correct, at this point? There, should we, okay.
No, we're good.
We're good. Yanhua, just looking forward to hearing about your research today, and want me to, I can take notes in the back, and you know, sort of when there are questions, I can keep a roll on how we're going there. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Yanhua. I'm a PhD student from Masaryk University in Czech Republic. This is my very first few weeks in the workshop. And today I'm going to present one of the projects I'm working on for my PhD study. First of all, a general picture of what my PhD work is about. So I'm focusing on how to apply different network approaches to study the structure and the functions of the governance system. And in particular, I'm illustrating these approaches in different case studies. It can be the transboundary resources of the deforestation or the global agro-commodity, or it can be the rather small scale common pool resources. In this case, the Danube River in Vienna. The network approaches that I am applying here include this situational approach, also network of action situations, and the social network analysis. These are the two network approaches that have been applied in the literature, but seems to be two rather separated fields, even though recently there is some tendency of emerging them. So another important part of my work is trying to bring these two approaches together. But today, to get started, I'm going to just focus on one project, which is to apply this situational network approach to study the river governance in Danube east of Vienna. This is a joint collaboration with some ecologists in Vienna, and also together with my supervisor, Christian Kemi, who used to be here. Yeah, Mike knows him. Okay, to give you some background about this study. It is the social-ecological system has been studied quite substantially, and this underlying connectivity of the resource use system and also their functional interdependencies is rather illustrated in the transboundary resource system. But we think it is also important to look into the small-scale common pool resources, and to apply the network approaches to look into the system. And in the case of social-ecological system, two different type of network approaches have been developed. So including this social-ecological network analysis, where they are treating the social actors and the ecological entities as two different type of nodes, and how different links between and among these different type of nodes can be captured to form up the social-ecological network. Another direction is a situational network approach. So network of action situations. And later on, in 2019, the framework of the social-ecological action situation, where they are more explicitly considering the ecological situation by considering that ecological entities have their agencies. Therefore, we need to consider their interactions and also the ecological interactions with the social process, therefore forming up the CEAS framework to explain how the emergent phenomena in the social-ecological system can be explained. And here in this work, we are focusing first from the situational approach, because we think it provides an analytical advantage of unpacking how a diversity of social processes can from the social system in regards of the decision-making process can be in interaction with the ecological and therefore leads to any kind of modification and feedback from the ecosystem as well. The gaps that we identify here is that there has been in the NAS framework, there has been work to incorporate the temporal dimension to uncover how the development or the involvement of the institutional settings over time have been changing or have been affecting the governance outcome. However, this hasn't been very explicitly included in the social-ecological action situation framework because, well, it is a rather new framework to be proposed. Therefore, we think it is important to address the temporal dimension in the social-ecological system, but within the situational approach. And we illustrate how this dynamic network of social-ecological action situations can be studied based on an empirical case study on the river, which has been seen as a complex social-ecological system for long. And historically, it has been perceived as quite an achievement of the environment controls by humans to gain economical benefits from the river for generating the hydropower or ensuring the inland navigation. However, later on, there has been more conflicts between these economical benefits and nature conservation. Therefore, there has been a proposal of the shift of the management where changes from that we are fighting against the water and control the flooding to that we are giving room to the water and live together as a system. Here is a brief description of what the case study is. We study this 48-kilometer river stretch that is in between of Vienna and Bratislava. It is one of the last free-flowing section of the upper river. It's important for transportation because of its geological location. And also since 1996, this area has been declared as a national park, which is also a hotspot for the biodiversity and the different ecosystem services. And the main issue in this area is the disconnection of the floodplain area with the main river channel that can be dated back to the 19th century, where the environment control measures of the dam construction and the hydropower plants has been established to prevent flooding and also to ensuring the navigation. Therefore, different management paradigms or system has been sort of developed over the time to trying to fulfill the needs of these different perspectives, namely the inland navigation, the flood control, and also the nature conservation. Here I give an illustration of what are the key events happening in this area for its historical development that we are dating it back all the way to the 19th century, because that is what they called the Great Danube Regulation, where they are establishing the dams and leads to mainly to prevent flooding and also to support the navigation. And one major issue happened here is in 1984, there has been an environmental movement in this area because of the projects of constructing a hydropower plant in this area, Hamburg-Au. And thousands of citizens has been engaged in the movement to resist the project. And it goes to the Supreme Court, and in the end, the project was cancelled, and lead to the establishment of the national park in this area called Donau National Park. That's in 1996. And in order to, because of the structural position of this area to be a national park, it naturally follows all the environmental regulations from the Austria and also from the EU, since Austria has joined the EU. So in 1998, they proposed this concept called the overall river engineering project, where they are trying to use the engineering measures to ensure not only the so all kinds of needs to be fulfilled. And from 2006, there has been some disputes over the concepts of this FGP and the planned projects that they want to implement in this area, mainly involving the NGO. It doesn't involve much of the citizens in this period, but mainly some NGOs, the local ones and the international ones are quite active in fighting back, not fighting back necessarily, but to debate over certain measures inhibited in the FGP concept. And from 2012, they implemented a pilot project in a 3-kilometer area in the Bad Deutschburg area. Yeah. And in together to support this project, they also developed stakeholder participation modes, where a stakeholder forum are established, where different stakeholders, mainly from the sectors of the natural conservation and the navigation, has been invited to the forum. They don't necessarily have the decision-making power to decide on what kind of project to be implemented or the planning activity, but they got informed and they can give comments and feedbacks on these projects. And one thing to note here is that since the pilot project, a new actor of the a private project company was emerged, which is under direct control of the government to be fully in charge of the project, and they are also the ones to facilitate the stakeholder participation in the forum. And since 2017, a different set of measures, where what they call as catalog of measures, are implemented. So catalog of measures is an sort of a revised version of the FGP and the pilot project in the previous period. So they made some changes over the operational activities in terms of how to managing the river. And also, they revised the mode of the stakeholder participation from a forum into something they called as advisory board. So it's different forms of stakeholder participation and also different ways of implementing the projects. That's the general picture of the historical development of this area in terms of its management and governance. So we think this is quite complex, and it provides quite a good basis for us to fulfill what we identified as a gap to capture how the social-ecological interactions and processes over time could be analyzed in understanding the SES system. And particularly, we ask these following questions in terms of institutional arrangement and governance process and their changes, and also how over different time periods, what are the impacts on the governance outcomes. And here, to evaluating the governance outcomes, we select 2 indicators from the ecological analysis in terms of their habitat reachability, habitat connectivity, and also the water depth stability, which are the two indicators perceived by the stakeholders to be one of the most important criteria for them. So the nature conservation sector and the navigation sector. A little bit of introduction about the framework we're using. So the social ecological action situation, it can be, they conceptualize three types of situation. So social action situation, ecological action situation, and social ecological action situations. Where within the social action situation, they consider how the social actors are interacting and making decisions together, which I think it's quite the same as the IAD. While in the ecological system, they consider the ecological entities and their interactions. And the social ecological situation captures how the human actions have a direct impact or linkages with the biophysical system. So altogether, they form up into this nice configuration. And these two links explains how it will contribute to the emergent SES phenomena, and also how the phenomena is getting back into the affecting the configuration. And I will not go very deep into the methods of calculating these two indicators, but these are basically the two indicators in terms of river ecological status that we are trying to capture. So first of all, the lateral hydrological connectivity, which captures the degree of how the floodplain areas are connected to the main river channel. So the higher, the better, of course. And then the habitat connectivity, which is calculated based on the lateral hydrological connectivity. And it specifically analyzed how the movements of the species of the organism within the riverscape can go from one area to another area. And we have analyzed the temporal changes of these indicators to see whether there has been the improvements in terms of the habitat's availability for the biodiversity in the whole river and the floodplain area. Here are the sort of three snapshots of the SES configuration that we identified. First of all, the way we divide the time periods are based on the types of the river measures that are being implemented in the area. As I mentioned earlier in that historical figure, so period 1 is the focus of the environmental control measures on constructing dams and the hydropower plants. And in period 2, because of the establishment of the national park, they have the river measures will have to include the environmental focus, where the FGP and the pilot projects are in play. And in period 3, it is a continuation of the FGP, but also a revision. So we want to capture how these changes at the focal action situation, what we call as FSMEA river measures, are emerging, and what can be the institutional arrangements or the settings that explain such changes. And that's from the social process. And because of the inclusion of the ecological action situation, we are also able to capture how the feedback between the social and ecological system can also explain the changes of the operational level activity changes. I don't have much more time, but I will just slightly explain this figure. So on the left side, where we identify the three types of the action situation based on the SES framework. And on the right side, for the social and the social ecological action situation, we further distinguish it between the three governance levels. And the links between these situations, we follow 3 types. So the red represents institutional link, the gray represent informational link, and the blue represents the biophysical link. So here the black one should be the blue. I haven't changed it. But generally, and also to note that we didn't, in this figure, we didn't capture the linkages between situation based on the common actors they have, but rather we will analyze it in the next step, because here the links are directed, but the common actors, they are not directed. I'm still trying to figure out a nice way to present this analysis, but it's not that clear, but this is also a way to also help me to organize the analysis, also actually inspired by the lectures we've been having in the past 2 weeks. So here it's more of an analysis of what are the actors involved in different situations and what are the rules and actions within these situations. And we also have the general developments over 3 time periods, how the situations are changing, how the involved government actors are changing, and how the rules are changing. And the highlighted red color are the ones that we found in this very preliminary stage, we found to be important in driving the changes of the system. I will not go into the detail, but maybe we can talk about it later. What I found to be, okay, so I will just present some of the preliminary findings from this figure that we think to be the important aspect to be considered. So for instance, at the collective choice level, we have the situations of the stakeholder participation. And this stakeholder participation is fed with information from the monitoring activities. And therefore, they also give information to feedbacks to the river measures. And also the dispute activities in the period 1 has led to the changes of river measures of the FAS, and led to the period 2 on the establishment of the national park, and also the changes again in the focal action situation, which also led to a further dispute over how these measures can be carried out, and led to the stakeholder participation and the river measures. So it's a little bit messy, but what I want to say here is that there are different pathways or linkage types that are connecting these different situations across levels and driving the changes. That's what we are trying to capture. What are the processes that can help us to explain how the changes happen? And here, these are just the different, a few of the pathways that we identified to be the important ones. Okay, so we want to structure the analysis. Like I said, it's been quite a challenge to unpack everything, but the direction that I'm trying to follow here is that to see first from the social process, how different governance levels, situations are changing, and help to explain the operational activity, and also the dynamic feedback between the social and ecological system, which is derived from the interaction of the social and the social-ecological action situation. And these are the ones that has been captured in these different links. And I'm still on the process of figuring out a way to present it. So this is basically the stage that I am at, and I want to maybe discuss with you about what are the challenges that I've been facing to work on this case study. So it's quite complex because we have to consider different types of linkages across situation. And we also have the roles of actors in the system and also different governance levels and the situational types. And most importantly, we are doing this dynamic network analysis. So all these components will have to be somehow explained also across time. So that's what I found the most difficult part. And also another thing is that how to derive the innovative findings from all the results that can be derived, found from all these aspects. So this is the general picture of the study and the stage and the future steps. And thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback.
So questions, who wants to start us off? Mike?
Thanks, James. You sound very much like a student in the middle of a dissertation. And so I want to assure you there is life after the dissertation. Okay, you will get through this. Could you go back to your next to last slide, please? I'm just trying to. You've carved this up. No, not that one. The next one. Move for that one. The multicolored transitions you've got there. It's kind of useful. As I understand it, the AS disk and subscripting is a problem on these kinds of things, but you do a pretty good job. Refers to civil society, basically, right?
Right.
And then the SP is the stakeholders.
Yes.
How are you distinguishing between civil society and stakeholders?
Yes. So this DIS represents the dispute, where dispute captures the disagreements or the conflicts between mainly the government authorities and the civil societies, including the citizens and the NGOs. And it is usually happens in the form of the environmental movements or media coverage, not in rather an informal way of influencing the decision-making process. But SP represents social stakeholder participation, which is a more formal way of how stakeholders are engaged in the decision-making process, which only happens in period 2 and period 3, because that's the time they started to establish the stakeholder forum. That is facilitated by the governments and the private company in charge of the projects.
And push on that because I'm still having a little bit of trouble here. So I understand sort of the civil society is when a dispute becomes kind of popular and the media gets involved and environmental groups get involved. And so it's kind of happening outside the formal institutions. And the stakeholders are meant to be the formal actors. And I know you'd have the government agents in there, government agencies relevant to the various levels, what I think be in that stakeholder. But who else are you talking about? Are you talking about corporations, transportation corporations, river tourist sort of organizations? Are you talking about, what are you talking about in terms of what's included? Because there could be citizens groups or interest groups, environmental groups could be seen as stakeholders too.
We define the scope of the stakeholder participation just within that formal forum that they established. So there are other interest groups, like you said, the citizens or the local communities, which are not in the forum. We only consider what the interactions and outcomes from this formal forum are coming out to affect the governance.
So are the discussions in those forums not very well covered in the media? Is that sort of a more confidential kind of discussions? Well,
they have it's internal meetings, but they have information briefings to the public, to the media regards to the projects. I think frequently, but the conflicts within the stakeholder forums happened in period 2 when different like this navigation and the nature sector actors, they don't agree with each other. And also conflicts happened outside of the forum where there is the media coverage over the projects. So these are the 2 different types of participation, which I consider it as formal and informal ways of participation, and also these 2 different types of conflicts.
Yeah, that wasn't clear sort of in the paper, sort of how that was sort of, so it's really a public component to that. That's an interesting distinction to make. I'll let you get to your next question while I think about that.
I have questions, but does anybody else want to jump in here? I always have questions.
Go for it.
Okay. Go.
No, you go first.
Okay, I'm curious because you're over these 3 time periods. Do you have any participants or informants that actually were involved in this entire stretch? Granted, they'd be rather old at this point if they're like an adult and involved in the 1980s.
Hey.
Sorry. I mean, but like, do you have anybody that like is able to inform like in your interviews or like this entire period? I'm curious what you gather from those participants.
Okay, you meant by the participants that's been there long enough to know how things has been evolving, right? So the ways that we construct this timeline here from 2 sources. One is this historical documents, not historical document, but the documents over this area that's being published by the government or by the media that we go through with that, and also the stakeholder interviews. And in particularly, since the stakeholder participation, like these formal ways, in the form of advisory boards at the moment, starting from 2017. So we are only having access to those people.
Okay.
So quite a lot of them are the members of the previous stakeholder program. So at least we have the overall view of how period 2 and the period 3 have been evolving. And out of them, there's one umbrella organization that's been in Austria, like the local ones been there for a long time. So they know the history, they know the development of the area. And there are also a lot of scientific research over this area, but mainly from the ecological perspective of how different, like since the 19th century, how the regulation has been affecting the area. Disconnection of the floodplain and later on the pilot project and the river engineering project. So they are technically analyzing how these different river engineering measures will have an impact on the river ecologically. So yes, so these are the different sources that we use to trying to understand how the system works over time.
Gotcha. And I suspect, I mean, this reminds me of the work that's gone on in the Chesapeake Bay in the United States. It's like in a similar fashion, because I'm looking, at your watershed, which crosses several different borders. I mean, you got this, I think the Swiss Alps that fall in there. You got Germany, Czech Republic. I mean, you have probably 9 different countries that are part of this watershed, just like, the multiple states in the Chesapeake Bay, and like sort of how challenging it would be to manage this watershed. So thank you for that, I guess more insight into that. Wes.
Yeah, so I got a few comments. So the first, I think a lot of people are touching on, which is just in general, so it's like good benefits of structural restructuring in a sense, like in particular, the first case study slide you gave of the timeline. There is a lot of information on that slide, and as an audience member, like I don't know what to do with it. Which we have this framework that you're using that helps us structure that. So I think when you're thinking about your presentation into the future, think about like structuring, presenting that information along with how the framework might represent it. Or even in a sense, you can just like start giving us results all throughout, as long as you have this good structural, like piece by piece walking through. Because if you throw us all the background and then start to analyze it, we don't know what to do with the background. We've lost the background in our minds because there's just a lot. Like as you're struggling with, there's a ton of stuff to analyze. So I think some structured on there. The more substantive comment was thinking about ecological action situations. And so as you lay out, I think your ecological action situations are really just measures of ecosystem outcomes. So you have your 2 measures and you say those are the action situations, but I don't think those are actually the action situations. The action situations are like the people who make decisions over stuff that leads to that. So you talk about like the governance decisions, but buried in your paper is like 2 sentences of what I think is like the lead, which is you talking about like local managers responding to those measure outcomes to do different kinds of things like change in the embankment and other kind of processes. That to me, that's your action situation for the ecological node. And so I think here, the way to emphasize it is to talk about feedbacks from those outcomes to decisions. And that's really the network effect. Otherwise, what you've done is you've just done a network analysis to get an outcome. So that's not really overlaying two networks because you haven't connected them unless you talk about the feedbacks, which I think you know and is in here, but I would like to see that more forefront and more structured around that feedback.
Yeah, great, thank you. Maybe I first address the second questions about these feedbacks between the social and the ecological system, which will definitely be a highlight of the paper, but I haven't been able to really write it up. So that's the direction I definitely will follow. And another thing about this ecological action situation you are talking about, this feedback about how the local managers, they are getting information about the river status and then update their activities. I think that is more of the social-ecological action situation. So it still involves the social actors to make decisions here and they are touched on the physical world. But for the ecological situation, I agree that what's being sort of in the paper that we're highlighting the ecological indicators about different this habitat index, but still there are the interactions within the biophysical system, such as how the restoration measures are affecting the connections between the floodplains and the channel, which is which will be illustrated in this measure, the hydrological connectivity measure that is within the structural network of the river system. But I haven't been able to really go deep into the details of how the interactions of the river patches are connected and also how they are changing because of different measures are being implemented over time, which is another concern that I have, that whether it makes sense to go that deep into the ecological analysis, because I still feel like this paper or this work is as framed for the communication for the institutional scholars. Therefore, to what extent that, which is also the challenge for the interdisciplinary research, right? That how do we balance the details in the paper for the communication? But I really agree with your comments about the substances of the ecological action situations are not that well captured in the paper yet.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. I think, sorry, I'd only say one more very quick thing. Maybe it's my problem with the underlying framework then and not your paper per se, but like, I feel like ecological processes aren't an action situation if there's not people involved. Like if there's no decisions being made, it's kind of strange to frame it as an action situation.
Well, yeah, I've heard some comments about that before. I think the people who propose this framework, they are really just trying to make the ecological system in play into the analysis, to not really as like two separate social and ecological system, but to really trying to find out a way of how to combining them. Action situation by its original definition, it has to somehow involve the social actors and their actions. But then it's sort of neglects the agency of the ecological entities, isn't it? Like, in this case, I think they illustrated quite well how if you catch one type of fish and how these human-made decisions are going to affect the ecological system because of the food web in the ocean. And if you don't, this framework is able to capture how the dynamics of the food web will also further give feedback to the human actions. Yeah, I think maybe different people will have different opinion about this kind of conceptualization, but I found it quite useful.
Just checking in with others.
Actually, some of this is a follow-up.
Okay, go for it, Mike.
I found that timeline you had very useful. It wasn't in the paper. And as you commented, it would have been useful to have that sort of here to be able to look at it while you're talking about the different sort of phases. So if you're thinking in terms of making a presentation, somewhere, especially in a job talk or something like that, handing that out might be a good idea. And maybe a handout on a little bit more information on your action situations, which is what I really want to ask you. Before I get to the action, dig into the action details, because that's sort of the getting into the weeds. This question about whether you can have an environmental action situation or not is tricky, and it's ideological, because there are some who are arguing very much that, I mean, I think you had some quote there from Claudia Puwasto about giving the river room or something was one sort of phrase or something. And we had a scholar associated with the workshop who came in here who is examining a case where the native peoples in New Zealand say that the river should have its own agency in the river management sort of thing. And it's a very interesting sort of way of doing it. But by calling it that, you automatically have some people saying, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Environmental action, there's no action situation. So if you can find a way to say that there are some ecological processes that are going on without direct human intervention at the time, the humans may be shaping sort of approach, but there are things going on that we don't really have control over. I mean, that's a little easier to say than that they have agency. I mean, in a way, you're saying they have agency because the rest of the species in the ecosystem, can do things without us, and changes happen without us. And if it's without us, it's not really an action situation, because we're not thinking about it. It's not part of our governance process. We may be trying to control what's happening there, but there's I don't know. It's a terminology thing. I had a co-author who's wrote a paper on environmental action situations and trying to make that argument explicitly. It's just not a nice fit into this sort of approach. Okay, can you go to your big figure of all three of the time periods in the action situations? When I read this, this is again something to be great for people to have, because that's impossible to read. What I think is really useful, I mean, I printed it out in 3 different pages so I can sort of see what's going on. I think if you can use this figure to explain what are the major changes between the 3 periods, okay? And let me see if I've got it correctly in this. And again, you may want to think about the subscripts. Some of them are good and some of them are a little confusing. This I understand now is disputes. Okay, and you have that pretty prominently in the first period and the second period, but it seems to be gone in the third period. Are you telling me this is no longer public disputes going on over the river use in this time period?
That's what we found.
Really?
Yeah.
Boy, tell us that. I had to dig that out. I mean, if this has now become an environmental setting where there's no public dispute, no media sort of coverage of the problems that are going on here, that's big news. Okay, that there's been some sort of a significant change in the way this system has been governed that nobody's publicly complaining about. If that's the story you're trying to tell, tell us that explicitly.
I wouldn't call it in that way, but
It's not on your graph.
Yeah.
It's missing, okay? Because I think another way, I mean, I would have started with what's new, okay? You started with the base situation when it was just damming the river for hydropower and flood control, right? That's all that was involved. Well, then these nasty environmentalists start getting involved. Well, not nasty, okay. These environmentalists start getting involved. Okay. You don't want to stay away from them. And so you've got now more disputes, I would presume. That's a little more intense than it was in the first period. Okay, so maybe it's some sort of like, but you've added 2 social action situations, I understand it. One is with the state park, which I understand, because you're having a state park sort of established. That's sort of a major administrative change. You have now a new set of actors in that. But that's also the AS supplemental. I guess that's the EU coming in. Okay, the supranational sort of organizations. Okay, so that's maybe not as important as the state park sort of coming in. And tell us a little more about how the state park changed the situation. How did making this a state park change the way in which the previous functions were or were not implemented in quite the same way? Okay, because I get the sense in the third period, you still have the state park is the one on the far right over there is still involved.
You mean national park?
Excuse me, national park, I'm sorry, national park, sorry. It's sort of way over to the right, and it's like it doesn't seem to be part of the action, even the main part of the action. Has it become less important as this new national plan is being implemented for the use of the park? Is that somehow fundamentally changing the way in which the national park is being managed? Because that looks to me like it changed. Because otherwise you've got the same action situations in place, except you don't have the public disputes anymore. But it looks to me like the national park doesn't seem to be quite as strong. But see, I think that there's sort of a more general point here for this in presentations. You've got to use your figures to help tell your story. Okay. And by telling a story, you sort of legitimate the fact that you've got these complex figures going on here, and that you're using these figures to sort of keep track of the fact that the governance system of this particular stretch of the Danube River has changed in fundamental ways. And you're trying to understand why it changed in what ways, and what were the effects of that on the environment, on these particular environmental conditions. So the more you can make it clear how these three periods are different. And I think a lot of that is buried in your figures, but you can't really expect us to extract that, except for people who are kind of obsessed with what networks of action situations look like. Okay. Sorry. I don't want to dominate here.
Do you
Can I respond?
want to say anything or?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for pointing out the mistake. I fully agree that I should have put the dispute in the third period. I didn't mean by removing it that there is no public involvement in this river area anymore, but rather the disputes are gone. But there's still the media coverage and the involvement, because also the citizens participating in the information or the briefings from the government. So yeah, maybe I will also change the conceptualization of what this dispute situation is about. Maybe it's by saying disputes, it kind of overlooked the part of the more regular participation of the citizens or the public into the management. So I will maybe also change the title as well. And second of all, the national park. I'm not sure if I fully understand your question. Here, national park emerges from period 2 and the existing afterwards. So both period 2 and 3. And I don't intend to say that their positions are somehow changing or they are becoming less important. By looking at the figure, actually the links that they have are different, are the same, remain the same. And I'm putting national park here at the operational level, because that national park also have their management and their activities in the biophysical system. So that's what I want to capture here. But it's not meant to mean that I'm overlooking that they also have their legal status in terms of maintaining the area. So actually, I would say national park is one of the important situations here because of the.
Can I make a quick follow up on this? If you go to one of your end slides, I don't think you listed national parks as one of the most important aspects go back.
Yeah.
Yeah, see on your green one over there for period 3, the national park's there. So it's like it may be there, but it's not the important one. See, there's some action situations are more important than others. If you can find a way to represent that would be useful. I think that absence there said to me, because the disputes were there and the disputes are there, which is kind of interesting because it's not even in your figure here. You've got to have some way of highlighting what are the important action situations. There's 10, 11, 12, whatever it is, things going on here at once. So now I'll shut up.
So an idea that's probably I think would help you to address Mike's points is the following. Maybe it sounds too radical, but I think with respect to the final outcome, I don't think it will be. So I would start forgetting about dynamic networks, socio-ecological action situations, everything, and I would write 5 solid pages on the history of this. So what were the players involved in each period? What were the issues? How they were managing the resource? What were the disputes? How these things change? 5 or 4, whatever you need, solid pages on the history. And at that moment, you don't know if they are networks, dynamics, so you forget all that. Once you have all those things there, those 5 solid pages, you start asking yourself, what interesting things are going on here? Why things change? What is a puzzle? Why this player is doing A and not B? And then you come up with 2, 3, 4 interesting questions to write about it. And then you start digging in your theoretical tools to see what kind of tools help you answering those 3 questions. And then maybe you find that there is some interesting dynamic that doesn't require networks. There are many interesting dynamic things that do not require networks. Or maybe this is not a dynamic issue, it's mainly a network thing, meaning there are complicated externalities, because when you use networks, but there are complicated externalities that go in so many directions, that's why you put networks, no? So, and then you go back, no? And then you start using the framework to answer your questions. My feelings right now is the framework is becoming exactly the opposite. So your theoretical stuff is blocking you understanding interesting thing rather than being your surf in the purpose of answering interesting questions. And I think at the end, the theoretical framework will come back. So you will not be in, so maybe even the title of the paper doesn't need to be changed, but it's going to be a much more exciting paper. Again, it's good, but it sounds radical, but at the end, I don't think it will be.
Okay, Silvermall, and then we'll go.
Yeah, maybe I might lose the thread a little bit, but Professor Gustavo almost came to where I was coming from, and what triggered me to ask the question was, as Professor McGuinness said, that public who doesn't ask anymore. Now, you come also from a civilization that has a lot of linkages with rivers, so am I. So, your Yangtze River of sorrows, of flood and everything. And I live in Delhi. The Yamuna River is a polluted river for how many decades, I don't know. Every year, I think your second time period, 1954, it came. So from then on, every government before the election promises a lot for, restoration. So there is a, you can say, measure that is said, but the action, everything goes below the water because there's no accountability. Anything below the water, nobody can really miss. So the money is wasted. But, before just coming to the question, it's very interesting that the Green Danube regulation, you wrote about the 19th century, or maybe before that, or I don't know the exact year when it came. But if you go back to that very popular waltz, the Blue Danube, written in 1866 by Johann Strauss. And when it was played for the first time in 1867, he was very upset with, the quality of that. And, and he made a statement, let the devil take the worlds, but I'm more worried about the quota. And by the quota, he meant, the measure within that particular composition, which needed correction. And there were a lot of corrections. Not only he himself did, but he got other composers or musicians also to play it. And today, in 27 or maybe in 2023, when your project is still going on there, this song still remains popular. So I don't know, I'm sure there is no regulation between that, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that are we, or the fundamental point of our research or is it fitting into the real concern on which possibly you are doing the project? And I told you my problem that I have a polluted river all the time. At one point of time, it used to smell. You couldn't drive by that side. Now it doesn't smell, but the pollution hasn't improved. And so have I really answered the larger question of improvement? I mean, the parks and all are things on top that you can see that there has been, but has actually in this whole period of time, as you are doing it, not getting into your theoretical aspects, seen the changes that have impacted, or public and everyone have just become activists and all have gone silent and not able to impact what you are intending to research? I have more complicated it.
Should maybe I first respond to first the you.
Everyone must respond and then we'll.
Actually, I just want to add to both of your points, if it will be same, because I just agree and join you in that, because your paper, your research is much more complex and precious than the paper is. Yeah, you are very reduced and that in this framework, and you're using new important concepts that have rethought IAD and SES and CS. You actually use SEAS, which is a socio-ecological action situations, which were suggested by Maya from Environmental Resilience Center in Stockholm, which I'm also interested in connectivities of habitats and transboundary ones, including intercontinental and in planetary governance, which this Stockholm Institute focuses on planetary boundaries. That's why those emergent ecological phenomena are so important. It's about climate change impacts, and it's about populations that are, as you mentioned, non-human. And I think you should bring that more forward to show how your paper contributes to that. So actually expansion and transformation of the theories, and something that Elena Ostrom would also be happy, because that's what it's about. It's not only just to reuse that theory, but also re-theorize changes, and that's very important momentum in the because of climate change and planetary governance issues. And I totally agree with you that your outcome is very clear there, but it's not clear in your title, and it's not clear in the beginning of your paper if it's about your draft. It's biodiversity conservation, and it's about habitat connectivity. And once we realize that this habitat is not only human species, not only human beings with our cultures and governances, but the populations that you mentioned of other, and that's for your research is resource governance of this common pool that is not common pool only for humans. Yet the rivers in Europe made borders porous at a certain point because the water had to be shared by human beings. But today, your concern is that this is a water not only for human beings to use, but it's a common pool resource for other species. And that's what makes your papers very precious, and I cannot wait to make a reference to it when you publish, because it's very important research. And yeah, the stories that you can tell, it's like 5 papers. Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, like unfold it, like there's so much depth in it.
We have 3 minutes left. Would you like to address any of
3
this?
minutes.
Oh, you go ahead.
Maybe I first respond to the questions about what you have said about these another rather radical ways of reconsidering how the paper can be structured. I would actually say that that's how I get started. That is why I started with making this timeline. So I am not, when I'm making this timeline, I'm not thinking about social-ecological action situations. I'm looking into the documents, the material, and I'm trying to identify what are the key events going on there. And after identifying this, I'm using the framework to help me to further structure what are these different events, and what's are their attributes, on what are the actors there and how they are interacting. And that's where I'm involving SEAS here to explain. But then when I'm analyzing it within the SEAS, I got a little bit lost because of the complexity, I'm really being honest here. But I think this conversation actually gives me some very good ideas or directions in how to move forward with the analysis to restructuring and also to bring forward these timelines, also keep in mind when I'm presenting the result. Thank you for that as well. And I think also for Subi's question about whether if I understand right, your question would be whether the river actually has got the improvements, which is how we are trying to evaluate here with indicators of these different connectivity index, like what you have said. Here, these are the two indicators, and I didn't have it in the presentation, but the ecological analysis indicates that there are significant increases for the hydrological and habitat connectivity in that sense. But again, these are not the interactions as what we discussed before. These are just indicators. I will have to make it more clear of the interactions of these different river patches because of the river measures.
I heard the bell toll for the student building. And so 1 o'clock, I know there may be a few other questions. But please feel free to figure it out. Thank you very much.